In today's Elden Ring video, we're gonna take a look at a really amazing God of Thunder Faith/Dexterity build. I wanted to make a lightning spell-centric build from the very beginning, and I can finally say that that's totally possible. You will have several lightning abilities that deal very high damage right from the start, one-shotting most early enemies and completely melting bosses. The build also makes heavy use of Faith with some dexterity thrown in the mix, as we'll add a katana to buff it with lightning damage, so let's begin. Now, in terms of classes, this could work well with either Prophet or Samurai. Why, would you ask, given the fact that they are so different? Well, because whichever you pick, you'll want some of the traits from the others. Prophet obviously has the slighter advantage, given the fact that it starts with a massive boost of Faith, so you can go ahead and use some of these spells right away, and you also get that massive boost to these abilities since they scale up with the Faith. And besides, if you want a good weapon, you can always get the Spear Uchi Katana that you can find from the Death-Touched Catacombs very early in the game on this side of the map, though you will need about 5 or 6 more points into dexterity to meet its minimum requirements if you play as a Prophet. Other weapons can obviously be used, including the Prophet starting one, but I mean, the katana is just an amazing weapon to have early on because of its swift attacks and really high damage. This brings us to some of the very early on items you will want to focus on with this build, which will likely bring you to the Weeping Peninsula. There's 2 spells and 1 important upgrade here that you will want to get right away. The first one is the Flame of Frenzy, which you acquire from a corpse resting by a pillar inside this church around the center part of the peninsula. This scales its damage with Faith. It requires Faith to function and will completely annihilate bosses way into the end game. It's one of the strongest abilities in the game actually, but we will focus on that in just a little bit. Now, the other skill that you can get in the same area is the Lightning Strike, found just a bit southwest of the same church in the canyon that leads to the nearby ruins. You can approach this from either side of the cliffs using the statues to make your way down and then killing the rolling beetle to get a lightning strike ability from it. Though I will say that this is something that you will use a little bit later since it has a higher faith cost of about 28. And finally, also grab the Faint Knot Crystal Tear from the nearby cliffs right here to the north side. You're going to find it pretty much mid of this well. It's going to be needed to craft a potion later on that gives you a huge boost of faith and infinite mana, but more on that in just a little bit. The final one is going to be the Lightning Spear. Now, this is going to be something that you can get from the east of Liurnia by killing the knight patrolling the road just south of the artist's shack right here on this side of the map. This mob will drop a dragon called Prayer Book, and what you need to do with this is to either bring it to the turtle at the Church of Vows or bring it faster to Brother Corin here at the Round Table Hold. Whichever of these NPCs you bring the book to will give you access to the Lightning Spear, the Electrify Armament and the Honed Bolt after giving them the book, so go ahead and buy them. Now, this is how your early game will look like and why I suggested to grab these items right away, especially that Lightning Spear. It's because it has a very low faith requirement of only 17, which means you only need 1 more level past the starting Prophet to use it right away. And this is going to be your main source of damage in the early stages of the game. Even fast casting this will mean almost, if not fully, one-shotting most of the enemies in the game, maybe with the exception of bosses. In those cases, you might want to fully charge this by fully pressing up that button and then releasing it for that additional lightning strike animation that drops from above when hitting the target with the spell. It's overall quite devastating, and the damage to FP cost, which is only 14, is relatively okay even for the starting stages of the game. Of course, it's probably not gonna be as used as liberally as you would with the Glintstone Pebble when playing as the Astrologer, but it also doesn't take 2 or 3 hits to fully kill a target. Now, if an additional hit is indeed needed for a target, or you simply want to save some of that FP, then this is where your melee weapon comes into play, and specifically if you also use that Electrify Armament to almost double its damage. Well, not really double, but it adds a ton of extra damage on top that does scale up with your faith. In this case, the katana works very well, and what's good about the Electrify Armament is that it lasts for a very long time. I haven't fully calculated this, but I think it's over 1 minute at the very least, if not 1 minute and a half. It lasts for a very long time, and it barely feels like I need to cast it in most of the combat situations. So between that and the massive damage from the spear, you should already be very good in the early stages of the game. Meanwhile, you still have the Flame of Frenzy, which is your boss melter, your main damage dealer during boss encounters. This is hands down the best early, mid, and especially late game skill that's second to probably none, at least to my knowledge. Not only does it deal very high damage right from the very start, it scales up with your faith, it has a low faith requirement, but it also provides madness onto your target, which means even two very badly placed shots like these are still enough to stagger even some of the toughest bosses in the game. The only downside to this ability is the slow wind up, which means you have to actively search for openings into the boss's attacks before you can follow up with a charged blow from this ability. So just like use it after you see the boss using a strong attack, maybe when they're resting, or maybe when they're doing something else, or maybe when they have a distraction, this is the time to jump in and immediately cast these for some really high damage. Now there's also the subject of the lightning strike, which you got earlier from the Weeping Peninsula. It has a rather high faith requirement, but with some of the items we will talk about in just a little bit, you can more than meet those requirements. Especially you can mix the cerulean hidden tier that you can find from the volcano manor nearby from the tree over here. You can mix this with the faint not crystal tier that we talked about previously to get an infinite mana potion for 15 seconds that also gives you a boost to faith for 40 seconds. So this is going to be one of those spells that you can use before jumping in a boss fight and then immediately follow up with something like a lightning strike or any other faith-based lightning strike ability. Though it's probably not as efficient as Comet Azure is from the astrologer, it is going to consume your stamina, which means you won't be able to infinitely cast this despite having the cerulean hidden tier. It's still going to prevent the mana consumption, so it's still quite useful, and before you enter the combat against the boss, you still have infinite cast for about like a couple of seconds, so you can spam that in, deal massive damage, and follow up with other attacks after this is gone. Now, we've talked about these, but let's also go over a few extra items that will help you with both damage and also the faith requirement. One early option is the two-finger heirloom that gives you immediately 5 points into faith. You can acquire this quite easily from the seller at the Purified Ruins in East Liurnia, also early on, again if you just skip the Stormveil Castle by going onto one of its sides. The other one can be the Faithful Canvas Talisman, which buffs your incantations by about 15 to 20%, so this means 15 to 20% additional damage. You can acquire this from Caelid right here from the Crystal Tunnel in the center part of it. You simply have to navigate this cave until you reach a platform with a corpse that holds the item. Now there's also the Marika's Scar Seal, which is another amazing option simply because it provides 3 points into faith, mind, and also additional FP, which is perfect for faith-based spellcaster. You can acquire this from behind a waterfall near the aqueduct in the underground region, so you have to start from the ancestral woods right here on this side of the map, make your way on the eastern road, and then follow the aqueduct on a descending path until you reach that lake with the waterfall, just following my route over here, and then you should reach the item right away. And there's plenty of examples both early and later in the game. There's also the Carrion Filigreed Crest that reduces your FP consumption, though I found that it's not such a big difference. You can probably go with something that buffs up your damage or increases fate scaling. And there's also like later on items that further buff your lightning, but in the early stages these are some of the best that I've been using. Anyway, final thoughts about the build. It's a strong starting one, quite unique, that uses lightning attacks. I wanted to play with lightning, so this was the best build caster that I was able to come up with. Of course, it doesn't come without its drawbacks, mostly boiled down to the squishiness and the mana consumption. So when you play with this build, you have to have a proper positioning and know the boss fights well enough to know exactly when to follow up with the strong attacks. But otherwise, it's very fun, definitely makes you feel like a god. So let me know down below how it fares for you, and I'll see you guys in the next video.